A little girl stood at the school gate, humiliated and in tears. Her teacher had just sent her home for not wearing pants. But what the teacher didn't know was who her father was. When he found out, the school would never be the same. But before we jump into this unforgettable moment, are you subscribed to Epic Story Moments? Hit the bell so you never miss another shocking tale. And by the way, where are you watching from? Drop a comment and let's keep the conversation going. It was a regular school morning, and the little girl, Emma, had no idea that today would change her life. She woke up early, excited about what the day would bring. Her friends were waiting for her in class, and she couldn't wait to tell them about her weekend. Little did she know, this would be the day that would turn everything upside down. As she entered the school gates, she smiled at the friendly faces of her classmates. The sun was shining, and she was in a good mood. She had been looking forward to the school's annual talent show, and her best friend, Olivia, had promised to sing a song with her during recess. The day started like any other, but it was about to take a dramatic turn. In the middle of class, while the teacher was discussing the day's lesson, Mrs. Thompson, the strictest teacher in the entire school, walked by Emma's desk. Mrs. Thompson's sharp eyes scanned every student's outfit, looking for any reason to send someone home. She was known for having no tolerance for even the smallest infraction of the school's strict dress code. Emma, being a child who loved to dress comfortably, had chosen to wear a short skirt with leggings. It was something she had worn before with no issues, and it was stylish and appropriate to her. But Mrs. Thompson didn't see it that way. "Emma," Mrs. Thompson said coldly, her voice cutting through the classroom, "you need to leave the class immediately and go home. You're not dressed appropriately for school." The entire class went silent. All eyes were on Emma, and she could feel the heat rising in her cheeks. She felt humiliated. But I don't understand," Emma stammered. "This is how I always dress." Mrs. Thompson wasn't interested in hearing any explanation. "Leave now," she said firmly, pointing to the door. Emma gathered her things as quickly as she could, trying to avoid the eyes of her classmates. The embarrassment she felt was unbearable. She had never been sent home from school before. As Emma made her way to the door, she overheard a conversation between Mrs. Thompson and another teacher. "Some kids think they can get away with breaking the rules," Mrs. Thompson whispered harshly. "But I won't let that happen. It's time someone put them in their place." Emma's heart sank. She couldn't believe this was happening. She had never been in trouble before. She had always followed the rules and was a good student. But now, she was being sent home for something as trivial as her outfit. She walked out of the school building, feeling small and worthless. Her classmates' whispers followed her as she left. Some of them snickered, while others just stared at her in confusion. Emma kept her head down and walked quickly, trying to escape the humiliation. When she arrived home, she felt a mixture of anger and sadness. She couldn't understand why this was happening to her. She had always been a good student, and this felt like a punishment for something so insignificant. Her father, who had just returned home from a business trip, was sitting in the living room when Emma walked in. He looked up at her, noticing the tears in her eyes. "What happened, sweetie?" he asked, his voice full of concern. Emma hesitated for a moment, trying to gather her thoughts. She didn't want to upset her father, but she knew she had to tell him what had happened. "Dad, I got sent home from school today," she said, her voice trembling. Her father's eyes widened in shock. "What do you mean you got sent home?" Emma wiped her eyes and took a deep breath. Mrs. Thompson said I wasn't dressed properly for school. She sent me home because my skirt was too short, but it's not even that bad. I don't understand why she did this to me. Her father's face darkened. He was a man of few words, but when he spoke, people listened. "What exactly happened, Emma?" he asked, his tone more serious now. Emma explained everything in detail, from the moment she was called out in class to the whispers she overheard. As she spoke, her father's expression grew more and more intense. He could feel the injustice of it all, and he knew this wasn't just about a skirt. It was about someone humiliating his daughter in front of her peers, and that was something he could not tolerate. "Stay here," he said firmly, standing up from his chair. "I'm going to handle this." Emma watched as her father grabbed his coat and walked out the door, his face set in determination. He wasn't going to let this go. He had no idea who had wronged his daughter, but he knew one thing for sure. He was going to make sure they understood the consequences of their actions. As her father stormed out the door, Emma couldn't help but feel a sense of relief. She knew her dad would make things right. He was a man who always fought for what was right, and she was confident that he would handle this situation with the seriousness it deserved. Meanwhile, Mrs. Thompson was still sitting in her classroom, unaware of the storm that was about to hit her. She was grading papers, completely oblivious to the fact that her actions were about to lead to a confrontation that would change everything. When Emma's father arrived at the school, he walked in with a purpose. He didn't waste any time, heading straight to the principal's office. He was determined to make sure his daughter's humiliation would not go unpunished. "I need to speak to the principal," he said firmly to the secretary at the front desk. Now, the secretary, taken aback by his intensity, immediately made the call. Within minutes, the principal appeared in the office, looking slightly confused. "How can I help you?" she asked, trying to remain calm. Emma's father wasted no time. "I'm here to discuss the way my daughter was treated today. She was sent home for something as minor as her outfit, and it was completely uncalled for. You need to understand that this isn't just about the dress code. This is about respect." The principal nodded, her face turning serious. She had heard of Mrs. Thompson's strictness before, but she never expected it would go this far. "Let's talk about what happened," she said, motioning for him to sit. As they discussed the incident in more detail, Emma's father made it clear that he would not stand for this kind of treatment. He was a man of respect and fairness, and he would not let anyone treat his daughter with such disrespect. By the time the conversation was over, the principal was fully aware of how serious the situation had become. Little did Mrs. Thompson know, the consequences of her actions were only just beginning to unfold. Asterisk, the tension was palpable in the principal's office. Emma's father had just made his position clear, and the weight of his words hung in the air like a thunderstorm about to break. He wasn't just talking about a dress code violation. He was talking about the humiliation his daughter had endured and how the school, in its rigid adherence to rules, had failed to see the bigger picture. The principal sat across from him, her face a mask of professionalism, but inside, she was slowly realizing the gravity of the situation. Mrs. Thompson was one of the most trusted teachers in the school, known for her strictness and commitment to maintaining order. She had built a reputation for being tough but fair. But in this case, the situation had spiraled far out of control. Emma's father wasn't about to back down. He was a man who had built his life around standing up for what was right, especially when it came to his family. And right now, his family was under attack. His daughter had been humiliated for something so trivial, something that was entirely within the bounds of reason. She hadn't broken any rules intentionally, yet she had been made to feel small, vulnerable, and powerless. "You have to understand," he said, his voice rising just a little as his anger began to show. "I'm not here just because my daughter was sent home over a skirt. I'm here because no one should have the right to treat a child like that, especially when that child has done nothing wrong." The principal, sensing the urgency in his voice, nodded slowly. "I understand your concern, Mr. Harris, and I promise you will look into this. We take every complaint seriously. But Mrs. Thompson has always been an exemplary teacher. She follows the rules, and we value that." "The rules?" Emma's father interrupted, his voice a mix of disbelief and frustration. "The rules don't matter when they're used as a weapon to degrade a student. You think sending my daughter home for something as trivial as a skirt is upholding those rules? It's destroying her confidence, making her question her self-worth. And that's not acceptable." The principal shifted uncomfortably in her seat. She had heard about the strictness of Mrs. Thompson, but she never expected something like this. She had always trusted her to enforce the rules fairly, but now she was starting to doubt whether Mrs. Thompson's idea of justice was flawed. Meanwhile, Mrs. Thompson was completely unaware of the storm brewing around her. She was in her classroom, still grading papers and marking assignments, oblivious to the fact that her actions had set off a chain of events that would lead to one of the worst days of her career. She believed she was doing the right thing by upholding the rules, but what she didn't realize was that she had crossed a line. In her mind, she was just following the dress code. The school had rules for a reason, and she was known for being strict about enforcing them. She had done it for years without issue. So, when Emma showed up in an outfit that didn't quite meet her standards, she saw it as her duty to correct the situation. But what Mrs. Thompson hadn't counted on was the father of the student she had humiliated, the man who wasn't afraid to stand up for his daughter. She had no idea that Emma's father was someone whose reputation for justice and fairness was as unshakable as steel. As the principal sat in silence, trying to process everything Emma's father had said, she couldn't help but feel the weight of the mistake that had been made. The school had made the worst mistake of their lives, and it wasn't just about enforcing the dress code. It was about the failure to see the human side of the situation. It was about disregarding the emotional toll that the school's decision had taken on a young girl, a child who simply didn't deserve it. Emma's father, sensing the principal's hesitation, continued, "I don't want to make this about attacking Mrs. Thompson. I'm not here to destroy anyone's career, but I do expect the school to take responsibility for what's happened. You've hurt my daughter, and if you want to make this right, it starts with realizing the error that's been made." The principal nodded again, her face serious. "I understand, Mr. Harris. We will investigate this thoroughly and take appropriate action. I'll speak to Mrs. Thompson as soon as possible and see where we go from here." But as Emma's father left the principal's office, he knew that the damage had already been done. The humiliation his daughter had faced was something that couldn't just be erased by an apology. It was something that would stay with her, something she would carry with her for a long time. And that was what made this whole situation even harder to accept. Meanwhile, the rest of the school was beginning to feel the ripple effect of the incident. Word of Emma's public humiliation spread quickly, and students who had witnessed the event couldn't stop talking about it. They whispered in the hallways, sharing their opinions and expressing their outrage. Some sided with Emma, others sided with the teacher, but no one could deny that something had gone horribly wrong. In the days that followed, more students began to question the fairness of the school's policies. Was it really about enforcing the rules, or was it about power? Was it really about respect, or was it about control? Students and parents alike began to speak out, their voices growing louder with each passing day. The school, which had prided itself on its strict adherence to rules and discipline, was now facing an unexpected backlash. The tension in the school reached a boiling point. What had started as a simple dress code violation had turned into a full-scale controversy that threatened to tear apart the very foundation of the institution. Teachers and staff members began to take sides, and the principal found herself in the difficult position of having to navigate through a mess of conflicting emotions and opinions. As the days went on, it became clear that the school had underestimated the power of one father's determination to defend his child. They had made a mistake, an incredibly costly mistake, and now they had to face the consequences of their actions. The air was thick with tension as Emma's father made his way to the school. He had just left the principal's office, where he'd made it clear that the incident involving his daughter had gone too far. He wasn't a man known for showing emotion, but today, everything felt different. His daughter had been humiliated in front of her peers, and he wasn't going to let it slide. As he walked across the school parking lot, his mind raced. He had always been a man of calm resolve, someone who dealt with conflict in a measured, logical way. But this time, something inside him was bubbling to the surface. He could hear his daughter's voice echoing in his head. The way she had explained how she was sent home, how she had been dismissed without even a second thought. He couldn't stand the thought of her feeling small, rejected, and powerless. Emma had been crying when he first saw her, the tears of a young girl who had been hurt for no good reason. And the more he thought about it, the angrier he became. How could any teacher, let alone someone in a position of authority, treat a child like that? How could they humiliate her, especially when all she had done was wear a simple outfit she felt comfortable in. He entered the school building with a clear purpose in mind, his strides purposeful and determined. As he walked past the hallways, some students glanced up, noticing the intensity in his movements. They knew something was different about today. The whispers started as soon as his foot stepped into the school. Word of Emma's father's arrival had spread quickly, and soon everyone would know that something was going to happen that day. Inside the principal's office, Mrs. Thompson was sitting at her desk, completely unaware of what was about to unfold. She had just returned from her lunch break and was going over her lesson plans, thinking that everything was back to normal. She had thought the matter was settled, that Emma had gone home, and the issue was resolved. She had no idea that the storm was about to hit. Emma's father was now in the front office, where the secretary greeted him politely, but there was something in his eyes that told her this wasn't a routine visit. His presence was commanding, and she could feel the unease in the air. "I need to speak to the principal," he said calmly but firmly. The secretary tried to hide her nervousness as she picked up the phone, but it was clear to her that something big was coming. Minutes later, the principal appeared. Her face was pale, and her eyes were wide. She knew Emma's father was upset, but she had no idea that he was about to take matters into his own hands. She tried to greet him with a smile, but it was strained. The tension between them was undeniable. "Mr. Harris," the principal began, her voice slightly shaky, "I understand your frustration, and I want to assure you we're looking into what happened." "No, you don't understand," Emma's father interrupted, his voice low but filled with authority. He took a step closer, his presence imposing. "This isn't just about a simple dress code violation. This is about how my daughter was treated, how she was humiliated in front of everyone. She was sent home without a second thought, and now I'm here to make sure you understand that this is a much bigger issue than you think." The principal swallowed hard. She hadn't expected this level of intensity. She had seen parents get upset before, but none like this. Emma's father wasn't just angry. He was hurt, and that made him even more dangerous. "Mr. Harris, we will look into this thoroughly," the principal stammered, trying to calm him down. But Mrs. Thompson was only doing her job. She followed the dress code, which is part of the rules here. "It's nothing personal." "Nothing personal?" Emma's father asked, his voice rising now but still controlled. "You think my daughter's humiliation is just a matter of following rules? You're not seeing the bigger picture. It's about respect. It's about fairness." And when she walked into that classroom, she didn't just see a teacher. She saw someone who had the power to make her feel worthless. And that's what you're missing. The principal took a step back, visibly shaken by his words. She had always believed that the rules were the foundation of the school, but now she was beginning to question whether those rules were more important than the well-being of the students. Mrs. Thompson, whom she had always trusted, had failed to see the human side of the situation, and now they were both paying the price. Emma's father wasn't done yet. He knew that this wasn't just a conversation he was having with the principal. This was his stand, his declaration that he wasn't going to let anyone hurt his daughter. "The problem," he continued, his voice hardening, "is that you're missing the core issue here. It's not about enforcing the rules. It's about treating students like human beings. What happened to my daughter was unacceptable, and it's time for someone to take responsibility for it." His words were powerful, and they carried weight. For a moment, there was silence in the room. The principal was speechless, unable to come up with a reasonable defense. It was at this moment that Mrs. Thompson walked in, unaware of the heated discussion happening in the principal's office. She stopped in her tracks as she saw Emma's father standing there, his face a mask of anger and determination. "Mr. Harris, I didn't expect you to be here," she said, her voice shaky. The tension between them was palpable. "I'm here because of what happened to my daughter," he said, turning to face her. "You humiliated her in front of her classmates. And for what? A skirt? She was sent home for wearing something she felt comfortable in. And now, I'm here to make sure you understand the damage that's been done." Mrs. Thompson's face went pale. She had never seen this side of Emma's father before. She was used to dealing with students, but this was different. This was a father protecting his child, and she realized too late that she had made the biggest mistake of her career. It wasn't supposed to be like this, she muttered, but it was too late for apologies. Emma's father didn't let her finish. It's already done, but what matters now is how you choose to make it right. His words hung in the air, heavy with finality. He wasn't just asking for an apology. He was demanding accountability, and this was only the beginning. He would not let this incident slide. Not until the school made things right. Not until his daughter felt that she had been treated with the dignity and respect she deserved. And just like that, the school was on notice. Emma's father had made his entrance, and it had stunned everyone. No one would be able to ignore what had just happened. His words would echo through the school halls, and things were never going to be the same again. The day of reckoning had finally come for Mrs. Thompson. She had thought she was doing her job, following the rules, maintaining discipline. But as the principal called her into the office, she was about to face the consequences of her actions. Consequences that would leave her questioning everything she thought she knew about teaching, respect, and fairness. Mrs. Thompson entered the principal's office, the weight of the moment sinking in. She could feel the stares of the faculty members who had gathered there, their eyes heavy with judgment. She had always prided herself on being a no-nonsense teacher. She had built her reputation on being strict, but fair. She had never been one to take a student's side in any issue. To her, the rules were everything. But now, she was standing at the center of a storm she never expected. Emma's father had left the school that day with one goal in mind: to make sure that the school took responsibility for what had happened to his daughter. He had stood his ground. He had made his voice heard. And he had made it clear that he wasn't going to back down until his daughter received the respect she deserved. And now, he wasn't the only one holding the school accountable. The principal, still shaken by the encounter with Emma's father, had to act fast. She knew she couldn't ignore what had happened. The more she thought about it, the more she realized how deeply wrong the situation had been. Sending a young girl home over something as trivial as a skirt had been humiliating enough, but the way it had been handled, the cold indifference, the lack of empathy, was worse. It had gone against everything the school was supposed to stand for. The principal cleared her throat as she motioned for Mrs. Thompson to sit down. The teacher did so reluctantly, her face a mask of uncertainty. She knew what was coming, and it wasn't good. Mrs. Thompson, the principal began, her voice steady but firm. We've had a chance to review the situation, and after speaking with Emma's father and considering the impact this incident has had, we've reached a conclusion. What happened that day was completely inappropriate. You may have been following the rules, but you failed to see the bigger picture. The emotional toll it took on Emma was significant, and that's something we cannot overlook. Mrs. Thompson's heart skipped a beat. She had been expecting some form of reprimand, perhaps a warning or a simple discussion, but this wasn't what she had imagined. The principal's words cut deep, and Mrs. Thompson realized she was facing something far bigger than a simple misunderstanding. You may have had the best of intentions, the principal continued, but the truth is, your actions cause lasting harm to a student. And I have to be honest with you, it's not just about this one incident. It's about how you've treated students in the past. There's a pattern of behavior here that can no longer be ignored. You have been too rigid, too focused on enforcing rules without understanding the human side of the situation. And that's where you went wrong. Mrs. Thompson felt the weight of the words pressed down on her. She had always believed that following the rules was the most important thing in education. She had told herself that discipline and order were what made the school run smoothly. But as she sat there, surrounded by colleagues who had witnessed the impact of her actions, she couldn't deny the truth anymore. She had been wrong. She had been too focused on the rules and not enough on the people she was supposed to serve. In her effort to maintain control, she had lost sight of her role as an educator, someone who was supposed to nurture, support, and guide her students, not tear them down. The principal took a deep breath before continuing. Mrs. Thompson, I'm afraid we cannot allow you to continue teaching under these circumstances. We're going to have to let you go. Your actions have led to a breakdown in trust, and that's something we cannot rebuild overnight." Mrs. Thompson sat in stunned silence, her mind racing. She couldn't believe it. This was not how she had imagined her career ending. She had always been a model teacher, someone who took pride in her work. But now, as the reality of the situation set in, she realized that her actions had not only affected her future, they had destroyed the trust she had built with her students, her colleagues, and the school community. Her hands trembled as she tried to process everything. She had thought she was doing the right thing. She had believed in the power of discipline, in the importance of rules. But the truth was that her obsession with control had blinded her to the needs of the students she was supposed to be teaching. The principal didn't say anything more. There was nothing left to say. The decision had been made. Mrs. Thompson would never forget what had happened that day. The day she realized that sometimes, even when you think you're doing the right thing, you can still make the wrong choice. As Mrs. Thompson left the principal's office, her head hung low, the weight of the decision heavy on her shoulders. She could hear the whispers from the staff around her, some expressing shock, others disappointment. She had lost everything: her job, her reputation, and most importantly, the respect of the students she had once considered her responsibility. Meanwhile, Emma's father was waiting outside the principal's office, unaware of the decision that had just been made. But he didn't need to know the details to understand that justice had been served. He had come to the school not just to defend his daughter's honor, but to make sure the truth was known, that the school could no longer hide behind its rules when it came to treating students with dignity. When the principal finally emerged, her face was solemn. She made eye contact with Emma's father, and for the first time, she felt a sense of relief. It wasn't the kind of relief that came from winning an argument. It was the kind that came from knowing that the right thing had been done. "Mr. Harris," the principal said softly, "I want to thank you for your patience throughout this process. We have taken the necessary steps, and I hope that you and your daughter can find some peace moving forward." Emma's father nodded, a sense of calm settling over him. He knew that this was just the beginning of a long journey for his daughter, but this was a significant step toward healing. She would never forget the humiliation she had suffered, but now she had a victory to hold on to, a victory that came with the truth and with the assurance that justice would be served. "Thank you," he said quietly. "I appreciate you doing what's right." As he left the school that day, his heart was heavy, but it was also full of pride. He had stood up for his daughter, and he had made sure the truth was known, and that truth had changed everything. It was a lesson Mrs. Thompson would never forget, because the truth, as it often does, had exposed everything, and the truth had made sure that justice was served.